This presentation is going to look at the concept of protectionism, what it means, and why governments engage in it. Protectionism is the opposite of free trade, so to understand protectionism, we have to understand free trade. Free trade is trade with no trade barriers, and trade barriers include tariffs, which are simply taxes on imported goods, quotas, which are numerical limits, subsidies, and administrative barriers, which include paperwork that we make importers do before we allow them to import into our country. So when these trade barriers are absent, we have free trade. When they are present, we have protectionism. So why do some governments engage in protectionism? Well, there are several arguments for protectionism, some of which are strong, some of which are weak. The first argument, which is often used, is the so-called infant industry argument. In this case, it is felt that the government of a developing country is trying to encourage the development of an industry which is still young, and it doesn't want to expose that industry to international competition until it has grown to a reasonable size and gained a reasonable amount of expertise. So while the industry is growing and developing in an emerging economy, the economy sometimes puts tariff barriers around the industry to protect it from competition from the rest of the world. And this is the so-called infant industry argument. Another similar argument is with sunset industries. These are industries which have already lost their competitive advantage, but the tariff barriers are being put to protect these industries and to prevent jobs being lost too quickly. However, it is argued that putting tariff barriers around sunset industries actually makes the whole situation worse, because it just delays the time when the tariff barriers will have to be removed. And it just means that the job losses, when they happen much more drastically and much more suddenly. So let's look at a third argument for protectionism, or at least a situation where protectionism occurs. This is so-called crony capitalism. And this is where the business community and the government of a country are too closely related or connected. So that business people are able to convince government officials to put tariffs against foreign competition so that they can enjoy supernormal profits in their home economy. A fourth reason for protectionism is to prevent unfair competition. And by unfair competition, we mean that some countries put trade barriers up against imported goods because they fear that the countries to which they are exporting will also put trade barriers up. So they don't want to reduce their trade barriers if other countries are not willing to do so, which would result in unfair competition. And lastly, protectionism is sometimes used to prevent so-called dumping of goods. We know that many Western nations produce surpluses of agricultural products, such as wheat, milk, and corn. And they have to get rid of these by dumping them on the markets of emerging economies. And dumping means selling these goods at below the cost of production. And to prevent this kind of dumping, which destroys domestic industries, some emerging nations put tariff barriers on these imported food items. So we can see that there are several arguments for protectionism, but each of these arguments is weak, really, when we examine them. For example, the infant industry argument is weak because it leads often to a situation where tariffs are put on so-called infant industries, but then never removed. And this, of course, leads to a permanent protectionist situation. So the only valid arguments really for protectionism are the last two, which is to prevent dumping and to prevent unfair competition. All the other ones are fairly weak.
but they are sometimes quoted as reasons for protectionism. So we must remember that free trade is what is actually recommended by the theory of comparative advantage. A separate presentation will deal with comparative advantage in more detail, but you have to remember that the theory of comparative advantage recommends definitely that nations should engage in free trade. So therefore, free trade is recommended because it increases the global GDP and the standard of living for all. So what we can learn is that protectionism should at best be just a short-term measure, maybe just to prevent dumping or to prevent unfair competition, while negotiations are carried out so that all countries reduce their trade barriers simultaneously. And it should never be done really in the long term. So when we look at countries that engage in protectionism, there are very few arguments that can actually justify this being done. Although we see recently that protectionism seems to be on the rise. So it hasn't gone away. Economies and governments are still protecting their industries, but with no real economic justification.